Jeff out there?
Maggie is here. Want me to go get her?
Yeah, I forgot how to start. I mean, I started this, so.
I'll go get her. Oh,
Do you know how to do that?
I think so.
okay. Never mind.
I've already. Oh, here it is. All right, good morning.
You're welcome.
I mean, I knew there was a delay. There's a little bigger delay than normal. That's all right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. You know, I like telling these stories, and the thing to know about, you know, the Pali Canon, and you know, which is where all these stories come from. Actually, the story I'm going to tell, actually most of the stories, well, not most of them, but some of the stories that I tell come from, there's a book called Great Disciples of the Buddha. And each disciple has their own story. And, you know, you have to, you know, when you think about Buddhism, you just think about the Buddha. And you don't often think about the great disciples of the Buddha, of which Ananda was one. You know, he memorized all 84,000 sutras. You know, his memory was unparalleled. You know, but each of these disciples had lives of their own. You know, they had trials and tribulations and highs and lows, and you know, their own lives separate from the Buddha. And it's really interesting to give Buddhism a whole lot of perspective to really understand about the lives of these different disciples. We learn about Sariputra and Moggallana, who are the two chief disciples of the Buddha. Their story is fascinating. It's just so fascinating. They were best friends. Hi, welcome, come on in. And then we're going to learn about Ananda today. Ananda was the Buddha's attendant. And when I say attendant, you know, you think, you know, like secretary. And he didn't have a lot of secretarial type duties, but he had many, many other duties. And so his role was just so all-encompassing. So it's amazing he even got to sit and meditate, to be perfectly honest. Such was his role. And so we're going to learn about that today. But because this story doesn't take as long as, let's say, the Buddha's enlightenment story, which I told a couple of weeks ago, we're going to do a short meditation first. Is that okay with everybody? All right. So let's just get started. This isn't going to be super long. Just let's begin. Okay. So let's just start by taking a deep breath all the way in and all the way out. So what we're going to do is just a calming type of meditation. I know most people here are not doing great necessarily with everything that's going on, and that's perfectly okay and understandable and normal. So let's just focus on the breath just for the next 10 minutes. Now, when you're breathing in, know that you're breathing in. When you're breathing out, know that you're breathing out. Know when you take a short inhale or a long inhale. And know when you take a short exhale or a long exhale. So just really following the breath in and following the breath out. Not forcing the breath, letting the breath be quite easy and natural. And then notice how you feel when you're able to follow the breath all the way in and all the way out. Not deviating, not letting the mind race here or there. If you have a thought that arises, that's okay. You just note it by saying, thinking, and come back to the breath. Just saying thinking will snap the mind back to the present moment, which is where we're trying to stay, whether the present moment is happy or not. Just try to stay with the breath. Again, following the breath all the way in, and following the breath all the way out. And to make this even more enjoyable, you maybe even learn to smile a little bit when you're meditating. Smiling just kind of puts the mind in a better mood. It lets you take yourself not so seriously, which is what too many of us do. Helps us go a little easier on ourselves. You know, we're going to get lost in thought. That's okay. Just come back every single time with no judgment, no evaluation. Just come back. Let's just go for one more minute. And let's just open our eyes and come back into the room. It's important that whenever we meditate, just after you ring the bell or end your meditation's not over. It's always really important to at least for a little while, a couple of minutes, 5 minutes, whatever that time is for you, that you just kind of sit there and kind of, I don't know, maybe like integrate that meditative experience before you get up and start your day or end your day or whatever it is that you meditate. We don't want to instantly get up from meditation and watch TikTok or get on Facebook or Instagram or talk to your family or go watch TV or something like that. Make your meditation important. Make your meditation mean something. Sit there for a few minutes. And then you can get up. Mindfully, hopefully. And then begin your day. So, whenever I tell stories from the Buddhist canon, of course I always start with the Buddha himself and his enlightenment story. That's probably the most popular story. The second most popular story is his final days. Basically his last year of life, or even his last 90 days, really. The Buddha's parinirvana. And that's a wonderful story as well. But when we're talking about people not the Buddha, I think a really appropriate place to start is with Ananda. One of the things about the Buddha is that, when he left home and he eventually came back a couple years after he became enlightened, most people just went with him. They became monks as well. A lot of his family became monks. His mother, or stepmother actually, became the first nun, and all of her followers actually went with her. Ananda was a family member. Anuruddha was a family member. His father was never a monk, but he supposedly died. I think he was a stream enterer, which is like the first stage of enlightenment. His son became a monk, Rahula. And so a lot of his family members came with him, and one of those family members was Ananda. And the reason why Ananda is so important is because he was born on the very same day as the Buddha. Very same day. They had the same birthday. They were exactly the same age. And he was the Buddha's first cousin. Now, the Buddha's father, his name was Sudhana. Sudhana had a brother. His name was Amittadana. And his son was Ananda. All right? And Ananda's brother, it might have been his brother or his half-brother, we're not really sure, is another famous disciple named Anuruddha. But, Ananda grew up a prince. We don't really hear anything about his growing up. We just know that he grew up in the same time as the Buddha, around the same family. There are no stories of him growing up because it's not important. The Buddha left home at 29, became enlightened at 35, kind of went back a couple of years later, and then, Ananda said, "Oh, I want to come with you." A couple of things about Ananda. Ananda was probably, in the entire canon, the most popular person, the most beloved person. Such was he was very relatable as a human being. A lot of people found the Buddha just a little too much to kind of go up to, so they would just go up to Ananda, who was his attendant, right? And the really interesting thing about Ananda was that he was known for his unwavering devotion and his incredible gentleness with everybody he met. He had no pride whatsoever. He lived so subservient to the Dharma that pride could not touch him, fame could not touch him. And because of this, he had no enemies. None. I mean, even the Buddha had an enemy, or people who wanted to challenge him. The Buddha's cousin Devadatta is probably his most famous enemy. He hated the Buddha, couldn't stand him, very jealous of him. But no one disliked Ananda. Nobody. It was not possible. Another thing that was interesting about Ananda was that he didn't become the Buddha's attendant until he was 55 years old. As you know, the Buddha died when he was 80, and so Ananda was the Buddha's attendant for the last 25 years of the Buddha's life. And so the first 20 years, The Buddha had many other attendants, several other attendants, and the Buddha said that they were somewhat willful because they couldn't really adjust to the all-encompassing responsibilities that came with being the Buddha's attendant. They couldn't do it, right? Ananda comes, when he's 37, I think, 37, to the Buddha's Sangha. During the first Rains period, immediately gains what's called stream entry, which is like the first stage of enlightenment. But even getting to stream entry, a lot of people don't understand exactly just how hard that is. It's really, really hard, but he did it. And in that time, during the Buddhist time, you hear in the canon like everybody getting enlightened left and right, like everybody, like full enlightenment, like Arhat, full enlightenment all the time. But that didn't happen with Ananda, but that's okay. Ananda just kept on trying and meditating and just living his life, and really kind of perfecting his behavior, perfecting his mind, purifying his mind, and that's all he cared about. A lot of these other people were becoming, once returners and non-returners and arhants and like getting up to higher stages of enlightenment. Didn't affect him. He just kind of did his thing, and everybody loved him. And then it came time when the Buddha was 55 and Ananda was 55, because they're exactly the same age. And the Buddha says, I'm 55 years old now. I've had several attendants and none of them filled the role perfectly because of this willfulness that we talked about before. And he goes, well, now it's time for a new attendant. And several people offered their services, but Ananda just stayed silent. And the Buddha rejected many of these offers. And a lot of people asked Ananda, well, why aren't you stepping forward? Why aren't you saying something? And the reason why Ananda didn't step forward was because he said, I have complete trust in the Buddha that he's going to make the right decision. So it just didn't occur to him to step up and offer his services. He knew that the Buddha would just make the right decision, so he just kind of stayed silent. And that he had like that much confidence in the Buddha. And so the Buddha then declares that, yes, Ananda, you should become the attendant. But even then, Ananda goes, I have some conditions. I have 4 negative kind of conditions and 4 positive kind of conditions. And if you can agree to these, I will be happy to be your attendant. And the 4 negative conditions are, please never give robes to me. Never give me alms foods that have been given to you directly. If you received a dwelling place to stay, don't give it to me. And never include Ananda in any personal invitations that the Buddha might have. Don't include me. And then the 4 positive conditions were, if Ananda was invited to a meal, that he could transfer that invitation to the Buddha. If people came from far away to visit the Buddha, that he would have permission to lead them to the Buddha. That if Ananda has any doubts or questions about the Dharma, he could come to the Buddha at any time, and he'll answer those questions. And if he missed a teaching, if he's away, that he would repeat that exact same teaching for Ananda, just for Ananda. And then the Buddha says, yes, of course, I agree to all 8 of these conditions. And then he became the Buddha's attendant. And Ananda was endowed with just incredible wisdom. He's so much so that the Buddha would often ask Ananda to take his place. Like if he had to go somewhere, he was scheduled to do a teaching, but he had to go somewhere, or some other duty called him away, he asked Ananda to always, hey, can you take my place? And do it. He had confidence in Ananda. Ananda, a lot of times the Buddha would give just like a brief statement for the monks to kind of ponder, just a very brief statement. And the monks would often be very confused about this, so they would always go to Ananda, and then Ananda would be able to like give a complete like dissertation and teaching regarding this very brief statement. And when word got back to the Buddha about what Ananda said about this teaching on the brief statement, the Buddha would say, "That's exactly what I meant." So I would have said the exact same thing that Ananda would have said. And so he always said that Ananda was a living embodiment of the teaching. He had a very good relationship with women. It was very touchy for monks to be in the company of women because, the monks were celibate, and it was very important they stay celibate for their spiritual purification. But Ananda was fine with that. When King Pasenadi, one of the great kings, who was actually a close disciple of the Buddha, when his wives wanted to hear the Dharma, he asked, "Well, who do you want to come teach you the Dharma?" And he said, "Oh, we want Ananda." So Ananda would go and teach his wives the Dharma, and they were obviously very, very pleased. And they often even stood up for Ananda if somebody had chastised him. And the Buddha often said that, because Ananda was just a stream enterer, but when you're with a company of people who are in these fully enlightened, a stream enterer is called a learner. And often they say he's just a learner. And it sounds condescending to say that. Oh, Ananda's just a learner. But they didn't really mean it condescending, but it still sounds condescending. But the Buddha would often say, even though he's still on the higher path of training, it would not be easy to find someone equal to him in wisdom, not even his closest disciples who are fully enlightened. And he had, like I said before, an incredible memory. He could just remember absolutely everything, word for word. Every teaching that the Buddha gave, that Ananda heard, he remembered every single word. Every single one. And he was actually very good friends. His best friend was probably Sariputra, who was the Buddha's chief disciple. They had a wonderful relationship together. And so that also helped him as well. And again, Ananda had no enemies whatsoever. Again, he subordinated his life so completely to the Dharma that, like I said, fame couldn't touch him. He was like always humble, always kind, always gentle, and people just flocked to him, like all the time. Often, again, they found Ananda even more approachable than the Buddha himself. And so they would always go to him. And so much of Ananda's life was dealing with all these lay people and all these people who wanted an audience with the Buddha, and some of them just wanted an audience with Ananda. Teach me this, help me with that. And Ananda did all of these things in addition to doing all of his duties for the Buddha. And even when the more enlightened monks would call him a learner or something like that, and even one monk, this is like Mahakassapa, he said, he's just a youngster. This person, Ananda, you're still just a youngster. And he goes, I'm like 60 years old, I have gray hair on my head. What do you mean you're calling me a youngster? And so he kind of took offense to that. I mean, he didn't really think he was trying to be mean, but the use of the term youngster wasn't great, didn't sit that great with him. But he took everything in stride. But one of the things I think why he didn't necessarily worry about it was the Buddha said, "Don't worry, you will become enlightened before you die. It's going to happen." And so the Buddha had confidence in him, so it didn't really bother him very much. The other wonderful thing about Ananda is these great disciples of the Buddha. Often it was said that the Buddha said, this particular monk is the foremost in this quality, right? So Sariputra is the foremost in this quality, Moggallana in this quality, and all of these monks were the foremost in like one quality. I think 2 of the monks were foremost in 2 qualities, but Ananda was the foremost in 5. 5 qualities where Ananda was the foremost of all of the monks in the Sangha. So Ananda was the foremost in those who have heard much and who has learned the Buddha's discourses. He is foremost in those who have a good memory. He is foremost in those who have had mastery of the sequential structure of the teachings. He is the foremost in those who were steadfast in study, and he's the foremost of all the Buddha's attendants. So that's a really big deal. These other monks were foremost in maybe just 1 or 2. He's the foremost in 5. And so, because of this, Ananda holds really a special place. And the other thing about, if you take a look at the Pali Canon and you read all these stories, so many of these stories took place before Ananda was actually the Buddha's attendant. But they inserted Ananda into the story as the Buddha's attendant anyway, because it sounds better. It may have happened when, the Buddha was 40, and Ananda was 40, and it was early during the Buddha's, teaching career, and it was some other attendant, but when they came to write the stories down, they just inserted Ananda into that place, because he was just the foremost of all the attendants, and none of the other attendants even mattered. And again, it's not that they were bad, it's just that they weren't Ananda. Ananda was a very special person. And so Ananda had to do all of these things as the Buddha's attendant. He had to be the Buddha's personal attendant and kind of the Buddha's secretary. So I'm going to describe to you some of the duties that Ananda had. So he had to bring Buddha water for washing his face and toothwood for brushing his teeth. He had to arrange a seat. He washed his feet and massaged his back. The Buddha was old. We were all old. We all get old. He fanned the Buddha. He swept his cell. He mended his robes. He slept nearby at night, so he'd always be at hand. He accompanied him on rounds throughout the monastery. After meetings, he would check to see if somebody left something behind. He called the monks together even after midnight. And when he was sick, he would go and get medicine for him. And then once when another monk was sick, he and the Buddha would wash this other monk together. And that was that's a really big deal. That's a whole other story. And plus he had a whole lot of other daily tasks as an attendant. And then he had secretarial duties, like he facilitated all the communications between the monks. He resolved all the disputes. He was the go-between between the monks and the Buddha. He brought the teachings of the Buddha to other sects. And he was like an intermediary between the lay people and the Buddha. In one of those times, the Buddha's stepmother wanted to be a nun. He went back to visit home, went back to visit dad, he went back to visit his stepmother, who was really the only mother he ever knew, because his actual mother died when he was 7 days old. So this was the only mother he knew. Her name is Mahapajapati. And so the Mahapajapati says, when the Buddha was ending his visit, she goes, I want to be a monk. I want to be a nun. I want to be I want to be an ascetic. I want to learn the Dharma. And he goes, no. And he's told her no 3 times, and she was really upset. And so he goes walking to Vesely, which is some town a couple 100 miles away. She followed him. Now, this was a big deal because she is a queen. She wore the finest clothes and the finest shoes, and she follows him 200 miles to the next destination. And by the time that she gets there, all her clothes are torn, her feet are blistered and cracking, and she's filthy, and this is not becoming of a queen. And so Ananda sees her and says, hold on, what's going on here? And she goes, I tried to ask the Buddha if I could be a nun and if he would allow women into the order, and he said no, and so I came to follow him, to beseech him to let me do that. And Ananda goes, hold on, let me go ask for you. So this is a duty that he often did. So he goes to the Buddha and he says, Mahapajapati is here. She wants to be admitted into the Sangha. And, it would be great if you did that. And he goes, no, 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 like 3 times, which was kind of the custom in the storytelling. And then Ananda, super smart, he goes, let me try this another way. He goes, Buddha, are women capable of enlightenment? He goes, of course they are. And then he goes, well, this is your stepmother, the only mother you've ever known. She has nursed you, she has loved you, she has raised you. And because of these good deeds to a Buddha, maybe you can let her in. And the Buddha agreed. And she became the very first female ascetic, the very first Buddhist nun. That's another story, which is really fun. But that's kind of one of the duties that Ananda would provide. He would be this kind of intermediary. So I said that Ananda memorized all of these teachings. So he did. And it's customary that in the Buddhist canon there are 84,000 teachings. He memorized all 84,000. 82,000 came directly from the Buddha, and then 2,000 came from other monks. And so he was the Buddha's attendant for 25 years. And then they were both 80 years old, and the Buddha was going to die. He was going to pass away. Because Ananda was not like a fully enlightened being and didn't fully get, he was kind of, because of his duties to the Buddha, one of the reasons that he was not fully enlightened was he was still very attached to the Buddha. I mean, how could you not be doing all those different types of duties for the Buddha? You don't have a whole lot of time to meditate for yourself because you're just you're dealing with people all day, And the thing was, Ananda was so stricken with grief when the Buddha said he was going to die. One of the things that the Buddha said was, I could, if I wanted to, by sheer force of will, I could just stay alive if I wanted to. But Ananda was in such grief, he didn't get the hint. It happened a second time, and a third time, and Ananda said nothing. And then later on, Ananda goes, oh, I get it. Please stay alive. You said you could do it, stay alive. And the Buddha said, it's too late. I already said it 3 times. So, this is part of his very kind of unenlightened self. Any of the other enlightened monks would have said, please stay alive. But Ananda was just still consumed with grief. He just couldn't hear it. With all of his wisdom, with all of his knowledge. And again, the Buddha did prophesize again that, hey, you will be fully enlightened, don't worry about it. And then the Buddha dies, and then Ananda is crying. All the other enlightened monks, understand impermanence. They get it. They're stoic when he dies. Not Ananda. He was like inconsolable. So he had to go to his brother, Anuruddha, for some consolation. And so the Buddha dies, and then it comes time where the other monks are saying, okay, well, what are the teachings of the Buddha? We're going to have this council. It's called the First Buddhist Council, where all of the enlightened monks get together and decide on the training rules, decide on what the teachings are, decide on what other rules there need to be decided on, right? The organization of the Sangha. And they said, one of the rules is, in order to ascend, you have to be fully enlightened. And so Mahakassapa, one of the other monks who was very well known, he goes, all right, Ananda, you have to be fully enlightened if you're going to come to this Sangha. And you're the only one who knows all of these teachings, so you better get with it. And so he gets with it, and he goes out in seclusion, and other people find out that he went out where he was. And so they flocked to go see him because they were inconsolable too, you know? And so it's like, oh my God, I have to. He talked to the people. He was a very kind person. Of course, he talked to them. And then they left, and he finally had a chance to meditate. Because the council was the next day. And so it says, you know, after he lay down and after his head hit the pillow, but before his feet hit the ground, he awakened to enlightenment, to full enlightenment. And but the problem was, how am I going to communicate to the rest of the monks in this council that I am now fully enlightened? So, he literally levitated in. He levitated in, sat down, and the other monks saw that. Oh, okay, there you go. That was one of his kind of mental powers through enlightenment. And it's said that Ananda lived to 120 years old. He knew all of these teachings, and again, you know, everybody knows who Ananda is. He was the Buddhist attendant for the last 25 years. He was the foremost of all of his attendants. And he's probably one of the, besides the Buddha, the most beloved person in all of the canon. That's my story. Does anybody have any questions?
Ananda never complained?
Nope.
He sounds like he was overworked and underpaid.
Yep. But again, he was so, you know, he just lived for the Dharma.
That's crazy. So there are no stories of Ananda like feeling unappreciated?
No.
Damn.
None. There's zero. Again, you know, he was more beloved than the Buddha himself in many ways. Because the Buddha had at least one enemy, but not Ananda. Yes?
What's your source of information for the story?
Great question. So my source of information for this story is a book called Great Disciples of the Buddha. And if you look at that, the story of Ananda, I had to abridge this down because it's like, what time is it now? It's 7:47. So, all right. There's 80 pages to this story, 40 or 60 pages to the story. And so I just kind of have break it down into more manageable bits. But he lived a full and fascinating life.
So that's who wrote this book?
I forget. It's a couple of a monk and Herbert something. I can't remember the German name, but yeah, it's just Great Disciples of the Buddha, and it's like a green book, and it might even be in the library. has stories of all of his disciples. So that's my primary source of information.
Are there any like sects of Buddhism that do they is he worshipped anywhere around it?
I don't know the word worship. I mean, I don't think he's worshipped, but he is revered, certainly. All right, let's hear from our gracious host.
Hello. Hey everyone, my name is David. I am your host for tonight. Thanks for being here. We opened up this temple 18 years ago to introduce Buddhist practice to those who show up. Those who lead are not monks, nuns, gurus, teachers. They are not looking for students. They're just here sharing their interpretation of the practice. Every night we have different classes led by different people from various Buddhist traditions. We have a recovery sangha that meets several times a week if you're struggling with any kind of addiction. Our food redistribution program meets every Thursday downstairs at 4:30 and hand out some delicious peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to those in need. We have classes and programs every day, and everything we offer here is always free. The full schedule is on the website and also above the shoe rack in the entryway. There is a lending library. If you see a book you like, feel free to borrow it and return it when you are done. Please straighten up your seat cushion, and thank you for being here, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you guys. Have a great rest of your day and week.